Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. Today I wanted to bring you a whopping hour-and-a-half episode that will take you all deep into the national forests in Michigan. Something truly evil lurks there. Get ready, brace yourself. Let's begin. I grew up in a really rural, isolated area of northern Michigan, about 30 miles from the nearest town. My family has had a huge piece of land up there for generations, mostly just forest and fields. It's beautiful country, but also really wild and remote. As kids, my friends and I spent so much time exploring those woods and got to know the area like the back of our hands. But even from a young age, we always had this uneasy feeling anytime we went deep into the forest, like we were being watched or something. Just a gut instinct, but it never went away no matter how many times we went out there. We tried brushing it off as our overactive imaginations playing tricks, but a part of us could never fully shake that sense that there was something else out there with us, something not quite right. As I got older, I started hearing all these stories from other locals and hunters about finding weird, massive footprints, hearing bizarre noises at night, even claims of glimpsing some huge, hairy creature moving through the trees. At first, I just figured people were messing around, trying to spook each other with tales of Bigfoot or dogmen or whatever, but the encounters kept piling up, and the details were too similar to totally write off. It was the fall of 2013 when I had my first major experience myself. I was out deer hunting alone on our property on the evening of October 7th, around 8 p.m. It was getting dark, but I decided to stay out a bit longer since it was peak rut, and that's when the bucks are most active. I was just sitting still in my tree stand when out of nowhere, I started hearing these weird noises coming from the thicket, maybe 100 yards to my east. At first it just sounded like normal little critters scampering around, squirrels, raccoons, that kind of thing. But then the noises got louder and started sounding like heavy footsteps, branches violently shaking and snapping. Whatever was making that commotion was big, really, really big. My heart started pounding as the sounds kept getting closer and more aggressive. I could make out this deep grunting too, like some animal snorting and breathing hard. I grabbed my rifle, trying to pinpoint exactly where the hell these noises were coming from, but they seemed to be moving all around, erratically, circling me. Then suddenly there was this bone-chilling howl that sounded vaguely human-like, but still absolutely animalistic. It raised every hair on my body. That's when I knew this wasn't any bear or deer. This was something else entirely. The noises just kept intensifying for what felt like forever, probably 5 to 10 minutes. I was frozen stiff, white-knuckling my rifle, too terrified to even move a muscle. Just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense anymore, everything went dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Like the whole forest was holding its breath. I stayed put up in that tree stand for at least an hour after that, straining my eyes into the pitch black, but never saw or heard another sound. When I finally climbed down in near total darkness, I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life to get the hell out of there. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared shitless. I made it back to my truck without incident, but my nerves were absolutely shot. I was shaken to my core. The whole drive home, I just kept replaying every single noise over and over, trying to make some sense of what the hell I had just experienced. That guttural, almost language-like howl especially stuck with me. Is that even possible for an animal? The next morning, I went right back to that same area to look for any signs or evidence that could explain what happened. As soon as I got near that thicket where the noises originated, I immediately noticed all these heavily disturbed and trampled areas in the underbrush. Branches were twisted and broken off around 7 and 8 feet high. But it was the footprints that really stopped me dead in my tracks. Pressed deep into the soft ground were these massive canine tracks. Each one was easily 16, 17 inches long and around 7 inches wide. The stride length between them was 4 to 5 feet. I've seen plenty of dog and coyote tracks before, but these dwarfed anything I'd ever seen. Based on their depth and the shape, I estimated whatever left them must have weighed at least 500 pounds. As I followed the trail, I could see the paw prints had been joined by what looked like impressions from some huge bipedal creature. My hands were literally shaking as I took pictures of the whole scene. In that moment, I knew these were no ordinary animal tracks. This was the physical evidence I'd been hearing rumors and whispers about for years. The legends of dogmen and werewolf-like creatures that had been passed down for generations around here. Stories of a creature that walked upright like a man but had the body of a beast, with heightened senses and incredible strength, able to move quickly and silently through even the densest forests. Most people always dismiss them as silly tall tales meant to scare kids. But there were so many strikingly similar accounts spanning decades from all kinds of credible witnesses, loggers, hunters, hikers, who encountered something straight out of a horror movie. Unexplained livestock mutilations, creepy howls at night, these massive tracks found. Even the native tribes had their own versions of dogman or wolfman legends dating back centuries. I had always been the biggest skeptic about that kind of supernatural folklore, but having this tangible physical evidence right there in front of me, combined with my terrifying experience the night before, it made me seriously second-guess what I thought I knew about the world. Maybe there was some truth to these stories after all, some unknown species or entity that's haunted the northern Michigan forests for who knows how long. As I headed back home that morning, my mind was just racing with unanswered questions. Had I actually come face to face with the legendary Michigan dogman? Or was there some other plausible explanation for what I saw and heard? Deep down, I knew I couldn't just let this go. I had been given a glimpse into something unimaginable that most people never experience in their lives. For better or worse, I was committed to getting to the bottom of this and finding out the truth once and for all. Little did I know at the time, this was just the beginning of a long, crazy journey that would push me to the limits and test my sanity, a journey that I'm still on to this day. I'm originally from the Detroit area, but my girlfriend Emily is from this small town called Kaleva out in western Michigan, about 20 miles east of Manistee. We've been together for almost 3 years now. Her parents still live out there in Kaleva, so we visit them pretty regularly, especially during the summer months when the weather is nice. The area around Kaleva is really rural. Just a lot of forests, rivers, farmland, and not much else. It's right on the edge of the huge Manistee National Forest. Emily basically grew up exploring those woods and going camping with her family all the time. She knows that whole forest like the back of her hand from doing that as a kid. So anyway, in the summer of 2019, we were up visiting her parents for the 4th of July weekend. On the night of July 5th, after all the holiday festivities were over, Emily suggested we go camping for a night in the National Forest, just the two of us. She was really nostalgic about doing that like old times. I was a little hesitant since I'm a city guy and don't have much outdoors experience, but she assured me it would be fun and romantic to camp under the stars. We packed up a tent, sleeping bags, food, all that stuff, and drove maybe 15 minutes from her parents' place to this remote camping area Emily knew really well, right inside the boundaries of the national forest. As we were setting up our tent near this little creek, that's when the first weird thing happened. Emily had wandered off maybe 50 yards to look for some firewood. All of a sudden, I hear her just let out this blood-curdling scream that made my heart stop. I ran over to where she was, and she looked absolutely terrified, just pointing at the ground. I was like, "What is it?" And she's stammering, "Footprints, huge footprints. Each one had to be at least 17 inches long." I was trying to rationalize it, like, what kind of animal could have made those? But Emily was adamant. She said, "No animal, Zach, those are humanoid." The footprints seemed to trail off deeper into the woods, so we actually followed them for maybe 100 yards before the trail just disappeared completely into the thick underbrush. It was like whatever made those prints somehow vanished into thin air. Needless to say, we were pretty rattled at this point. Part of me wondered if maybe this was some kind of elaborate prank Emily was playing, but she seemed legitimately scared out of her mind. We debated just packing up and leaving right then and there, but ultimately we decided to stay and just try to chalk it up to some weird, unexplained thing. Maybe a homeless person or hiker had just come through with some crazy big feet. I don't know. I was just trying to stay positive. If only I knew then what was coming next, I don't think I would have stuck around. Because that freaky footprint discovery was just the beginning of a night of pure terror out in those woods. A night that's seared into my brain forever. We tried to settle in and relax after that unnerving start. Emily got a campfire going while I finished setting up the tent. As night fell, we cooked some hot dogs over the fire and just tried to make the most of our camping trip, despite the creepy footprints. But then around 10 p.m., we're just sitting there by the fire when Emily suddenly freezes up and grabs my arm in a death grip. Her eyes were wide with fear. She's whispering urgently, "Zach, did you hear that?" At first I didn't pick up on anything unusual, but then I heard it too. This deep guttural growling sound coming from the dark woods around our campsite. It was this low, aggressive grunting noise unlike anything I'd ever heard before. The growling seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, making it impossible to pinpoint where exactly it was coming from. We just sat there in dead silence, holding each other, as this growling grew louder and more frenzied, like something was working itself up into a frenzy. I'm not exaggerating. I have never felt such primal, animalistic fear coursing through me like in that moment. Then, as suddenly as it started, the growling just stopped completely. It got weirdly quiet again. We stayed frozen, not making a sound, waiting for whatever might happen next. That's when we heard the first bone-chilling roar explode through the trees, this deafening roar that just shook me to my core. It was so loud and so deeply unsettling, like the angriest, most primordial bellow you could imagine. Within seconds, other roars joined in from the pitch-black forest, creating this terrifying chorus of prehistoric-sounding screams. The roaring just went on and on, surrounding us from all sides of the tree line. Emily and I were petrified, just clinging to each other as these ungodly roars seemed to come from every direction around our campsite. My heart was pounding out of my chest, heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush towards us. Branches snapping, leaves crunching as these things converged on our location. The roars just grew even louder and more frenzied with each passing second. Emily kept whispering over and over, "Oh my God, oh my God." She was paralyzed in fear. I had no clue what to do. Part of me thought we should try to make a run for the car, but with those, whatever they were, seemingly surrounding us. That felt impossibly dangerous. I was afraid if we ran, we'd just lead them right to the vehicle and be trapped. So we just held each other tight and braced for the inevitable moment when those roaring beasts would burst through the trees into our campsite. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared for my life. I really thought Emily and I were about to be attacked and killed by some unknown monstrous creatures. But then just as suddenly as the commotion started, everything went dead silent again. The roars stopped. The footsteps stopped. This unnatural stillness just blanketed the whole forest. We stayed huddled together, waiting for what felt like an eternity, but whatever was out there never actually revealed itself. As the first hints of dawn light started creeping in, we finally felt secure enough to very carefully break down our camp and get the hell out of there as fast as possible. We didn't say a single word to each other. We worked quickly, jumped in the car, and just tore out of those woods like our lives depended on it, because they very well may have. The drive back to Emily's parents' place was completely silent, both of us still just trying to process the sheer terror we had experienced out there. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel the whole way. We didn't feel safe until we were back behind their locked doors. Once inside, that's when Emily finally broke down in tears, all the trauma from that night hitting her at once. I just held her and tried to stay strong, but I was utterly rattled to my core as well. What the hell had happened out there? What could make sounds like those growls and roars, sounds that seemed so primordial and otherworldly? We tried to recount all the details to Emily's parents, but they just looked at us like we were insane. Her dad insisted there were no wild animals in that part of the forest that could explain anything even remotely close to what we were describing. He seemed to think we had just let our imaginations get the best of us out there in the dark. But Emily and I knew what we experienced was real, terribly, viscerally real. The sounds, the feeling of primal danger, it was seared into our minds. We decided then and there that we would never go back into those woods again, not after narrowly avoiding whatever it was that had surrounded us. In the weeks and months afterwards, I pretty much became obsessed with trying to find some kind of explanation online for what we encountered. I scoured message boards looking for any similar accounts from that area that could shed some light, but I came up empty. It was like whatever existed in those forests around Kaleva and the Manistee area was just an anomaly. To this day, I still don't have any rational explanation for what happened to us that night. Emily and I have been forever traumatized by it. We've gone camping in other areas since then and have never come across anything even remotely like that again. It makes me wonder if there was something abnormal, something not of this world, lurking in those particular woods. I know it all sounds crazy, believe me. I wish I could find some simple, mundane explanation for everything we experienced. But the fact is, I can't. We were forced to face the possibility that there are things out there that defy logic and reasoning. And whatever they were, they represented threats not to be trifled with. So that's my story in full. Make of it what you will. If you do write it up on your site, please keep me anonymous. Even just recounting this makes my heart start racing again. I'm just grateful Emily and I made it out of those woods alive that night. I'll never shake the feeling that we came terrifyingly close to suffering some unspeakable fate at the hands of whatever was trying to converge on us. There are a few other details I should mention that I haven't gone into yet. When we first arrived at the campsite that evening, Emily pointed out some trees that had these deep gouging marks scored into their trunks and branches, as if something with massive claws had been shredding them. We didn't think much of it at the time, but after that night's events, it took on a more ominous meaning. Like whatever was lurking out there marked its territory through those claw marks. Another weird thing, When we first heard those growls building up, Emily said they sounded weirdly coordinated to her, like not just random animal snarls, but an organized, structured volley of growls that seemed to be communicating something. I know that sounds insane, but it's what her gut instinct told her in that moment. Oh, and one more thing. As we were breaking down camp at first light, Emily spotted this tuft of thick, reddish-brown fur snagged on a broken branch near the edge of the campsite. We didn't get close enough to really examine it, but it looked unlike any animal fur we had ever seen before. She pocketed it, and we still have it in a plastic bag, as I guess you could call it proof of something. The fur is just deeply unsettling. It's coarse and wiry, clearly from some unknown creature or beings. We've thought about maybe having it examined, but part of me doesn't want to know what kind of animal it could have come from. I think I have this deep subconscious fear that whatever tests were done, the results would just open up more disturbing questions than answers. So that's everything, like all the strange details from the most traumatizing night of our lives out there in the Manistee Forest. Whatever was happening in those woods, whether it was dogman, bigfoot, or something else that goes bump in the night, we want no part of it ever again. We've learned to be content in just leaving that as an impenetrable mystery. Back in 2010, I had this really weird experience that I just can't explain, no matter how much I try to make sense of it. It was one summer morning around 10 a.m., and I was outside doing some work in the backyard area near the little creek and woods behind my property. It was a nice, warm, sunny day, one of those really peaceful feeling mornings where everything seems chill and relaxing. As I'm working away, I start getting this nagging feeling like someone or something is watching me. At first, I just brushed it off, thinking maybe it was my imagination or some animal moving through the trees making noises. But the feeling didn't go away. It actually got stronger and stronger until I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I stop what I'm doing and stand there real still, straining to hear or see if anything was actually out there. That's when I noticed how weirdly quiet it had gotten, like there was absolutely no sound at all. No birds chirping, no leaves rustling, nothing. Just dead silence, which is really not normal for being out in the woods like that. I figured maybe a storm was coming in and that's why all the forest noises stopped. But the sky was still bright blue with no clouds. As I'm looking around, I get this really creepy, unsettling feeling go through me when I realize I can't even hear any ambient nature sounds in the distance. It was like every single thing had just stopped. Slowly, I turn around, scanning the tree line by the creek, and that's when I see this thing. It was upright and vaguely human-shaped, but definitely not any kind of animal. But it seemed to kind of shimmer and distort around the edges, making it really hard for me to get a clear look at its actual form. I just stood there staring at this weird apparition, straining my eyes to try and make sense of what I was seeing. The longer I looked at it, the more freaked out I got. There was just this undeniable feeling of power and something not normal about this world coming from its presence. After what felt like forever, but was probably just a few seconds, the figure started drifting slowly away from me, kind of gliding between the trees. I couldn't move or say anything. I just watched in shock as it disappeared back into the forest. As soon as it was out of sight, it was like sound and movement returned to normal around me. Birds started chirping again. A warm breeze made the leaves rustle overhead. But that really primal, dread-filled feeling took a long time to go away. I've tried over and over to come up with some rational explanation for what I saw that day. Maybe it was just some crazy trick of light and shadows playing on my mind. but I know what I saw, or at least I know what I perceived I was seeing in that moment. It just doesn't fit with regular logic and reason, but I can't simply write it off as my imagination either. I've never had anything even close to an experience like that before or since then. Sometimes I wonder if I somehow caught a glimpse of another dimension or plane of existence that briefly overlapped with our reality for those few moments. All I know is that single encounter really made me start questioning a lot of assumptions I had about the true nature of the world we think we know. I haven't really told many people about it because I know how crazy it sounds, but I felt like I had to get it off my chest and put it out there. Maybe someone else has had a similar mind-bending experience they can share, or maybe there's some normal explanation I've just completely missed. Either way, I'm kind of glad I didn't try to approach or interact with that entity thing in any way. I had this strong gut feeling that I was just an observer who happened to witness it, not somebody who was supposed to engage with it directly. So that's my weird story for whatever it's worth. Like I said, you can keep me anonymous, but maybe there are other people out there who have seen things that make them start questioning what we think is real and normal. I'd be interested to hear those kinds of stories too from others who have had experiences that make them rethink reality. My grandfather was a logger in the northern region of Michigan many years ago. He worked deep in the forest, felling trees and hauling the logs out with a team of horses. It was grueling work, especially in the bitter Michigan winters, but he loved being out in those secluded woodlands. From an early age, he used to tell me all sorts of strange stories about the things he witnessed or heard about while working those forests. Tales of unexplained sounds, strange creatures, and even disappearances of fellow loggers that were never fully explained. At the time, I just chalked it up to an old man's overactive imagination or him trying to spook me with ghost stories. But the older I got, the more I realized there may have been some truth to what he spoke of. And you see, I've had my own experiences in those same forests over the years. Unexplained sightings, sounds, even a few missing person cases that all seem to happen in the same general area my grandfather used to work. One of the earliest experiences I vividly remember was when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. My dad had taken me camping in the same forest where my grandfather used to work, said he wanted me to see the beauty of the place he spent so much time as a kid listening to his dad's stories. It was late at night and I was lying awake in the tent listening to the typical night sounds of the forest. Crickets, an owl hooting in the distance, the gentle rush of a stream nearby. Then this sound started, sort of a low rumbling that seemed to be coming from all around us. It grew louder, shaking the ground we were camped on slightly. My dad must have heard it too because he sat up suddenly and looked around with a startled expression. After a few minutes, the rumbling faded. Dad played it off like it was nothing, but I could tell from his face that he knew exactly what that sound was. He didn't say another word about it then or after when I asked. That was just the first of many bizarre experiences I had in those woods over the years. There were the nights I'd hear strange howls or calls that didn't sound like anything known to live in those forests, sightings of large creatures watching from the tree lines that couldn't be identified, feeling like you were being followed or stalked by something unseen anytime you ventured off the trails. Then there were the disappearances, people, hunters mostly, that would go missing without a trace in those deep woods, never to be seen again. Search parties would scour the forests for weeks and find nothing, no sign of struggle or where they could have wandered off to. It was like they just vanished. One of the most chilling incidents happened when I was 18. a bunch of us guys from town decided to go camping over near Miller's Creek, which ran through the heart of those woods my grandfather always talked about. Rite of passage kind of thing. We were up late around the campfire, drinking a few beers and telling stories like you do. At one point, Devin, who was a bit of a jokester, thought it would be funny to try imitating some of the weird howls and calls I had described hearing out there before. We all laughed at first, but then something answered back. This deep guttural howl that silenced us all. It wasn't coyotes or wolves. The sound seemed to be coming from multiple directions surrounding us. We all looked at each other with wild eyes, not knowing whether to be scared or think Devin had somehow faked the whole thing. That's when Brad pointed out towards the creek, and we all turned to see this huge hulking shape materialize on the other side of the water. It was bigger than any bear, sort of hunched over. We only got a brief glimpse as it lumbered back into the tree line, but we could all agree it didn't look like any animal we'd ever seen. Needless to say, we didn't stick around much longer after that. We broke camp right after first light and got the hell out of there. Nobody mentioned that incident for the longest time after, like we had all agreed never to speak of it. That wasn't even the last time I had an experience like that out there. There was the night I thought I saw a massive set of glowing eyes watching me from the ridge while I was night fishing. The time I found large, strange footprints that couldn't be explained. Hearing massive trees being demolished like matchsticks in the distance. As I got older, I became obsessed with trying to find explanations for all these bizarro occurrences. What the hell was out there in those forests? I spent years researching ancient legends from Native American tribes that used to inhabit those lands, theories about interdimensional beings. I was determined to find answers. During that time, I had a couple more deeply unsettling run-ins, like the morning I went walking alone before dawn, started hearing loud crunching sounds like something huge busting through the brush. I could feel the ground shaking with each step it took, like it was coming straight towards me. I've never run so fast in my life without looking back. Then there was the night I'll never forget. I was camping, doing more research near a large sinkhole area of the forest. Around 3 a.m, I was awoken by loud rock grinding sounds, like boulders being runted across each other. I turned my lantern on and shined it towards the noise, and that's when I saw it, staring at me through the trees with its inhuman sunken eyes, this gangly, skeletal figure at least 10 feet tall, its body seemingly made of tree limbs, bark, and rocks, fused together into a hunched bipedal form. We made eye contact for what felt like an eternity before it opened its mouth and let out a deafening scream that still haunts my nightmares. I blacked out from fear, waking up at dawn, still clutching that lantern. I know it all sounds crazy, like some cheesy horror movie, but I swear on my life, everything I've told you is the God's honest truth. There are things living out in the wilderness of northern Michigan that defy all logic and rational explanation, creatures interwoven with nature itself, possibly hopping between realities or the veil of our dimension. I'm just one of the unfortunate souls who picked up on their existence over the years. After that last incident with the tree creature screaming at me, I was pretty shaken up, as you can imagine. I decided to take a break from investigating for a while, try to regain some normalcy. But wouldn't you know it, the weird stuff kept finding me. It started with unsettling phone calls, just dead air on the other end at first. Then this distorted, garbled voice, like it was being transmitted from underwater or an alternate dimension. It sounded vaguely human, but in a sickening, twisted way. The first few times I just hung up, but then the voice started rambling about guardians of the wood and rifts opening. I shouldn't have kept listening, but I was morbidly intrigued. Around that same time, strange parcels started showing up at my door, wrapped in layers of bizarre symbols and markings. No return address, each one containing some arcane item, leather pouches filled with herbs and bones, small stone carvings of creatures I'd never seen, jars with strange viscous fluids, and God knows what else floating in them. I got the feeling it was all connected somehow to whatever was happening in those woods. The final straw came one sunny afternoon out of the blue. I was just mowing my lawn like any other day. That's when I noticed it. A thin, inky black vertical line had appeared, slicing through the air of my backyard. It was hovering there, pulsing and wavering like a tear in reality itself. I could have sworn I heard faint rumblings emanating from inside it. Before I could process what I was seeing, it started growing wider, those rumblings becoming a deafening roar. That's when I saw teeth, like massive gnashing fangs extending from inside the portal, stretching it obscenely wider. I turned and ran for the house, making it inside just as the sky overhead was pierced by something, letting out an ungodly, ear-piercing shriek. I peeked out the window to see the void had vanished, but the trees in my yard were all bent at insane angles, like something massive had weightlessly pushed through them. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I packed up and moved as far away as I could get from those forsaken forests. I'm just now feeling safe enough to finally share what I experienced after all these years. So, yeah, that's my story, the full, unvarnished truth of the terrors I've witnessed in that place. It was back when I was around 10 or 11 years old. And my family and I were living in a small town in rural Michigan at the time. One night I woke up feeling thirsty and decided to go downstairs to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As I was walking down the hallway towards the stairs, I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw it. A brilliant light hovering silently above the tree line in our backyard. At first, I thought it was the moon peeking through the clouds, but this light seemed too bright and too focused. I stopped dead in my tracks, squinting to get a better look. That's when the light began slowly moving from side to side in an unmistakable, sweeping motion. It was completely silent, but whatever this thing was, it was under intelligent control. My heart started pounding in my chest as the light suddenly took off at an incredible speed, leaving a faint trail behind it as it shot across the sky and disappeared from view. I just stood there dumbfounded, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed. After a minute or two of stunned silence, I finally regained my composure and raced downstairs to wake up my parents. I raced downstairs, skipping every other step, and burst into my parents' bedroom. "Mom, Dad, wake up!" I shouted as I flipped on the lights. They stirred groggily as I crawled up onto the bed. I just saw something crazy outside. My dad rubbed his eyes and squinted up at me. "What are you talking about? What did you see?" I struggled to get the words out, my mind still racing. There was this bright light hovering over the trees in the backyard. At first I thought it was the moon, but it started moving back and forth. Then it took off so fast across the sky and disappeared. My mom sat up in bed, exchanging a concerned look with my dad. "Are you sure you weren't just dreaming, sweetie?" "No, I'm telling the truth. I was awake, I swear." I pleaded with them. I could see they didn't fully believe me. My dad sighed and threw off the covers. All right, let's go take a look outside then. The three of us went out onto the back porch, peering out over the backyard. Everything was still and quiet, not a light in the sky except the moon and stars. I kept searching, hoping to see that brilliant light again, but it was gone. We stayed outside for about 15 minutes before my dad ushered us back into the warmth of the house. Whatever you saw, it's gone now, he said. Though he tried to sound reassuring, I could detect a hint of confusion and uncertainty in his voice. That night, I had trouble falling back asleep. My mind kept replaying that strange light dancing above the trees. Was it some kind of alien spacecraft? A weird experimental aircraft? Or was it all just an overactive kid's imagination? I didn't know, but I knew what I saw was real. I don't know, man. It was just this incredibly bright light silently zipping around up there. Then it shot off into the sky faster than any airplane I've ever seen. Jason shook his head in disbelief. That is so crazy. You have to tell the class. Everyone will freak out. But I knew better than to blurt out my encounter during class. I could already picture the teasing and ridicule I'd face. Still, the more I thought about it, the more I felt compelled to share what I had witnessed. A few days later, we were working on our daily writing journals when I decided to pen down the details of that bizarre night. I poured everything onto the page, trying to recount with precision the erratic movements, the blinding light, and that final burst of speed as the object took off. When the teacher, Mrs. Darnell, came by to collect the journals, she must have read part of my entry. She paused at my desk, eyeing me over the top of her glasses. "I need to see you after class about this," she said in a firm voice. My heart sank as I imagined her admonishing me for writing silly fiction when I was supposed to be focused on whatever prompts she had assigned. But when the final bell rang and the other students had filtered out, Mrs. Darnell didn't seem angry or irritated. Instead, she had an intrigued look on her face. "Michael, this journal entry about you seeing a strange light in the sky, I was quite compelled by the vivid details. You clearly have an incredible imagination and a flair for descriptive writing," she began. I opened my mouth to explain that it wasn't my imagination, that I really had seen this bizarre phenomenon. But before I could get a word out, Mrs. Darnell continued. "In fact, I took the liberty of making a copy of your entry to take home and show my husband. You see, he's the head of the local MUFON chapter, the Mutual UFO Network investigative body." My eyes grew wide as I finally realized Mrs. Darnell wasn't dismissing me as a fabulist. She believed me. Mrs. Darnell could see the surprise and bewilderment on my face. She gave me a warm smile and continued. "My husband Paul has been investigating UFO sightings and strange aerial phenomena around here for over 20 years. If what you described in your journal did in fact occur, he'll want to look into it." My heart was pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Part of me wondered if I should have just kept my mouth shut rather than put my bizarre encounter on paper. But another part felt validated that an adult was taking me seriously. "Of course, we'll need to get your parents' permission before proceeding with any sort of investigation," Mrs. Darnell added, "but I'll talk to them at the parent-teacher conferences next week if you're comfortable with that." I could only manage a mute nod in response. Mrs. Darnell thanked me for my extraordinary journal entry, and I hurried out of the classroom, my mind still trying to process everything. The weeks seemed to drag on interminably until finally it was time for the dreaded parent-teacher conferences. I remember sitting nervously beside my mother as Mrs. Darnell went through my academic progress. Then she reached into her briefcase and retrieved the copied pages from my journal. Before we wrap up, there was one other matter I wanted to bring to your attention, she said, sliding the papers across the desk to my mom. Your son described a rather unique experience in one of his writing assignments. I believe it may have been a legitimate UFO encounter. My mom's eyebrows went up in surprise as she quickly scanned over the pages. She looked over at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. Michael, is this about that light you said you saw a few weeks ago in the backyard? I nodded meekly, feeling a lump form in my throat. Mrs. Darnell allowed a moment for my mother to read the entire journal entry before continuing. As I mentioned, my husband Paul is quite involved with investigating UFO sightings around the area. With your permission, he'd like to interview Michael and potentially conduct a field investigation of the area where this event occurred. The room grew so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. My mom's expression was unreadable as she seemed to carefully consider Mrs. Darnell's words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she turned to me. Michael, this is a very serious situation. I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you really see what you described in your journal, or were you just making it up? And I looked back at my mother's probing gaze, then over at Mrs. Darnell, who watched me with solemn interest. Drawing a deep breath, I replied in a small but unwavering voice, "Yes, Mama, every word of it is true. I wouldn't make something like that up, I swear." From the subtle shift in her expression, I could tell my mother believed me. She turned back to Mrs. Darnell and gave a slight nod. "Very well, you have my permission to look into this. But I'll want to be present for any interviews or investigations regarding my son." Mrs. Darnell agreed without hesitation, shaking my mother's hand and thanking her for her cooperation. As my parents and I filed out of the classroom, I couldn't help but feel a surge of validation. For once, the strange thing that happened to me wasn't being dismissed or rationalized away. Instead, it was being taken seriously by credible adults. Over the next few days, Mrs. Darnell's husband, Paul, reached out to my parents to arrange a time for his MUFON team to come interview me about my UFO sighting. Mom and Dad insisted they be present, which Paul readily agreed to. The following Saturday, two polished-looking men in suits arrived at our door. Paul Darnell himself and a colleague he introduced as Dr. Frederick Martine, the head investigator for MUFON cases in our region. As a 10-year-old, I was immediately intimidated by these professional UFO hunters, as I thought of them. After exchanging pleasantries with my parents, the two men set up a small tape recorder on the coffee table and began asking me to recount every detail of what I had seen that night. I did my best, describing the brilliant light, its erratic movements, the manner in which it took off at blinding speed, just like I had written in my journal entry. Dr. Martine took copious notes while Paul Darnell asked me follow-up questions, getting me to clarify things like the exact angle and elevation of the light, how long the sighting lasted, the time of night, and whether I had noticed any other atmospheric irregularities. It was like being grilled by detectives. After about an hour, they wrapped up the interview portion and returned their attention to my parents. Based on Michael's extremely credible and consistent testimony, I'm confident we're dealing with a legitimate, uninitiated aerial phenomenon, a UAP or UFO event, Dr. Martine stated matter-of-factly. I could see the surprise and concern register on my parents' faces. Up until now, I think there was still some level of doubt that this was just an overactive child's imagination, but these supposed experts were treating it with grave scientific scrutiny. Paul Darnell chimed in. With your approval, we'd like to conduct a field investigation of the area where Michael witnessed this event. We'll carefully survey the ground, take radiation readings, search for any other physical evidence. He trailed off as my father cleared his throat. You're actually taking this UFO business quite seriously then? Dad asked, failing to mask his dubiousness. Dr. Martin gave a curt nod. I realize this may all sound silly or fanciful, sir, but we've learned to approach each claimed UFO encounter with an open mind and diligent scientific rigor. Too many potentially substantial cases have been dismissed out of hand over the years as sheer crackpottery. My dad seemed to weigh the man's words as my mom looked at him expectantly. Finally, he gave a resigned shrug of consent. Well, I suppose there's no harm in letting you take a look around. Just don't go making a media circus out of this. The two investigators assured them this would be treated with the utmost professionalism and discretion. With my parents' permission secured, they thanked us and said they would return in a few days to conduct their field examination of our backyard. True to their word, that next Tuesday evening the doorbell rang, and there stood Paul and Dr. Martin again, this time wearing futuristic-looking coverall suits and carrying archaic instrument cases that reminded me of the Ghostbuster proton packs. As any young boy would be, I was instantly captivated and impressed by their strange sci-fi gear. The two men gave me a reassuring wink before heading out to the backyard, sweeping the area with all manner of radiation detectors, electromagnetic field meters, heat sensors, and other curious instrumentation. For as boring as our little suburban backyard always was, that evening it felt like the outskirts of Area 51 with all their peculiar scanning devices and computations. After about an hour of meticulously sweeping the backyard with their high-tech sensors and instruments, Paul Darnell and Dr. Martin returned to the house with their bulky cases and equipment. I had been watching them intently from the kitchen window, dying to know if they had found any evidence of, well, anything out of the ordinary. As the two men removed their coverall suits and brushed themselves off, Dr. Martin pulled my parents aside with a grave expression. My heart raced in anticipation of some startling revelation. We've detected some highly anomalous environmental readings consistent with, well, something beyond our full understanding at this time, he began somberly. Specifically, we found significantly higher levels of radon particles and disruptions in the ambient electromagnetic field concentrated in the area where Michael indicated witnessing the UFO event. My dad furrowed his brow skeptically. And just what is that supposed to mean? You telling me my son really saw some kind of alien spacecraft that night? Paul Darnell stepped in diplomatically. What it suggests, Mr. Nelson, is that some kind of exotic electromagnetic phenomenon did in fact occur precisely where and when your son described his sighting? Dr. Martin nodded in grim agreement. We've documented numerous cases where UFOs or dimension-traversing spacecraft have caused measurable distortions in the surrounding subatomic particle fields and electromagnetic environmental outputs. He paused to let that piece of pseudo-scientific jargon sink in before continuing. Of course, these are still just anomalous readings, but they do lend significant credence to your son's testimony and indicate he more than likely witnessed, Well, something quite real and extraordinary. An uneasy silence fell over the room as my parents absorbed this sobering assessment. I could see them struggling to process it all, the implications of what it might mean. Had their young son really seen an alien craft of some kind? My mother was the first to speak up, her voice tense but resolute. So, what happens now? What are you proposing we do about this? Dr. Martine exchanged a look with Paul Darnell before replying. In cases like these, MUFON's standard operating procedure is to make a full disclosure to the proper federal authorities, namely U.S. Air Force investigative bodies and research divisions that deals with UFO, UAP cases. Those words hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, this didn't seem like merely an odd supernatural encounter, but a matter of potential national security. I could see the deep concern etched on my parents' faces as they silently weighed their options. Finally, my dad spoke up in a measured tone. Listen, I appreciate you gentlemen taking this whole situation very seriously for Michael's sake, but I'm not sure we're ready to go reporting any of this to the government just yet. For now, I think we should keep this among just us here until we can get a better handle on what it all means. The two investigators seemed to take his stance in stride, almost as if they had encountered such reluctance before. Dr. Martine gave a diplomatic nod. We understand your reticence completely, sir. This is admittedly a great deal to process all at once. Why don't we leave you with our full case report and contact information? Please take as much time as you need to mull things over, and if you have any other experiences or new developments arise, don't hesitate to reach out immediately. With that, they retrieved a thick manila folder and scribbled some numbers on the front before placing it in my father's hands. After thanking us for our cooperation, the two men showed themselves out, leaving our household to slip back into an uneasy quiet. In the days and weeks following MUFON's initial investigation, an awkward pall seemed to hang over our household. While my parents didn't outrightly dismiss or deny what I had witnessed, it was clear they were deeply unsettled by the idea that I may have had a real UFO encounter. There were hushed conversations between them when they thought I was out of earshot, though I managed to catch a few clipped phrases here and there. Their concerns over potential consequences or complications if this went any further were evident. Meanwhile, at school, my bizarre sighting quickly became the stuff of legend and rumor, despite my efforts to remain low-key about it. Word inevitably got around to the other kids that I was the UFO boy, whose parents had gotten real-life Men in Black agents involved. Some thought it was the coolest thing ever, while others just thought I was a flat-out weirdo liar looking for attention. About a month after MUFON's field investigation, my dad called a family meeting one evening. Your mother and I have been talking about everything that's happened, he began carefully. I could see the worried crease in my mom's forehead as she clutched her coffee mug tightly. We understand this whole UFO situation hasn't been easy to make sense of. And we don't pretend to have all the answers, Dad continued. But after a lot of discussion, we've decided to go ahead and file an official report with the National UFO Reporting Center. My eyes went wide at that pronouncement. Despite MUFON's urgings, I never actually expected my parents to take that next step. Dad raised his hand for patience. Now hold on, this doesn't mean we're inviting the Air Force to kick down our door and drag you off to Area 51 or anything. He allowed himself a momentary smirk at that before turning serious again. But the reporting center is a civilian-run organization that's been investigating and documenting UFO cases for decades. They're a respected, unbiased authority on the subject. If anyone might be able to help us better understand what you saw, it'll be them. I could feel my heart pounding as the implications set in. This was really happening. My unforgettable backyard encounter was about to become an officially documented UFO case. Over the next couple of weeks, my parents spent hours on the phone with the reporting center's investigators, meticulously recounting every detail of the sighting from my testimony and MUFON's findings. Finally, we received a terse letter in the mail stating that after a thorough investigation and analysis, my case had been appointed a CE2M10 classification. At first, those cryptic alphanumerics didn't mean much to me, but after researching them online, I learned the shocking truth. The reporting center considered my UFO sighting to be one of the most credible and compelling cases they had evaluated in years. The CE2 designation meant close encounter of the second kind, a UFO event that involved physical evidence of its existence, like radiation readings or environmental disruptions, the very anomalies MUFON scanners pick it up, and an M10 rating indicated. My case was in the highest category of credibility and strangeness. Looking back, I wonder if my parents truly grasped just how seriously my encounter was being taken by the civilian authorities on UFO phenomena. Whether they did or not, an even heavier unease seemed to settle over our household in the following weeks, as if we were waiting for the other shoe to drop. In the months and years following my UFO encounter being officially documented and rated as one of the most compelling cases in recent memory, our family's life did eventually return to a semblance of normalcy. No shady government agents showed up at our door to spirit me away for questioning. No alien spacecraft descended on our backyard to probe us with inscrutable technologies. And yet there always seemed to be a lingering uneasiness that something bigger, something cosmic and mind-bending had briefly brushed up against the mundane fabric of our lives that night. My parents never outrightly admitted it, but I knew they never truly regained that sense of the world being an ordinary, explainable place after having to concede their young son's testimony was deemed credible and legitimate by reputable investigative authorities. As for me, I can't say the experience of seeing that brilliant, erratic light in the night sky sparked any obsession with UFOs or the paranormal. If anything, it made me perhaps a bit more grounded and skeptical of most supernatural claims, knowing just how utterly strange and disorienting it feels to witness something physically tangible that seems to defy all rational explanation. In the decades since, I've had a front row seat to the ongoing global conversation around UFOs and potential evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, as the topic has swung from being a taboo and kooky notion to a serious scientific inquiry. I can't help but feel a strange sense of validation whenever I see yet another bizarre UFO video or hear high-ranking military personnel come forward about encounters they can neither explain nor deny. Because I know what it's like to be an ordinary person who stumbles into the crosshairs of one of these reality-shaking experiences, if even just for a few strange and disorienting moments. That endless wondering of, what did I really see? And I know the deeper, gnawing, existential uncertainties such an event can scratch at the edges of your mind, however hard you may try to unsee it and move on. In the end, perhaps there is no neat resolution or tidy answers when it comes to UFO encounters, and the question of whether we're being engaged by intelligence from other worlds or dimensions. All I can say is that fateful night granted me a lifelong harbinger of how unexplainable and wondrous the cosmos may yet reveal itself to be if we keep an open yet rational mind. The truth is out there, or so they say. I remain hopeful yet appropriately grounded. My story is really long, so please bear with me. There's a lot that happened, and this isn't just one isolated incident. I've had multiple experiences around this area, and I believe it all correlates. I need to tell you everything in detail, but before I do, let me give you some quick background. I'm an avid deer hunter and have been hunting the same stretch of woods in northern Michigan for over 15 years. It's a remote area with the nearest town over 20 miles away. The forest is dense with thick underbrush in most areas. My hunting cabin is pretty rustic, no electricity or running water, just a wood stove for heat. Over the years, I've had my share of strange encounters out there, but nothing that really scared me until last fall during deer season. That's when things took a disturbing turn. Let me start from the beginning. It was a crisp November morning, and I had gotten into my tree stand just before first light. As the forest started to come alive with the sunrise, I noticed something odd about 75 yards to my east. It looked like a large boulder or fallen tree, but it seemed off, too geometric and out of place. As the sun rose higher, I could make out more details. That's when I realized it wasn't a fallen tree or boulder at all. It was some kind of structure like a small hut or shelter made from branches and brush. My heart started racing as I tried to make sense of what I was looking at. As I studied it further, I noticed other strange things in that area I hadn't picked up on before. Things like patterns in the ground, almost like trails or pathways leading to and from the hut, breaks in the brush that seemed unnatural. At first I thought maybe it was some sort of campsite, but that didn't make much sense given how thick and remote these woods were. We were miles from any trail or road. Who would have built something like that out here, and why? The more I looked around, the more oddities I noticed. Stray pieces of fabric or string, unusual rock piles and formations, things that clearly seemed out of place in these woods. It was like stumbling onto some sort of primitive encampment, only there was nobody around. I'd hunted this area for over 15 years, spending countless hours in the woods, but I had never seen anything like this before. At least not in my neck of the woods. I'd heard stories from other hunters about finding structures or shelters deep in the forest, but I always chalked it up to hogwash. Campfire tales meant to spook the newcomers. But now here I was looking at one myself. I didn't know what to make of it. As strange as it was, I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on the hunt, but I'll admit it stuck with me, nagging at the back of my brain. What was I looking at exactly? And who or what could have built it? Little did I know that was only the first of many bizarre events I'd experience over the next couple weeks, events that would shake me to my core and make me seriously regret ever coming back to these woods. The next few days out in those woods were relatively uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about that weird structure I had seen. It just didn't make any sense. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just seeing things that weren't really there. But then, on the morning of the third day, I saw it again as I was making my way to a new tree stand location, the hut or shelter or whatever the hell it was. And not just that, but new additions that I could have sworn weren't there before. More trails or pathways leading to it, strange markings on the trees, rocks and sticks arranged in ways that didn't seem natural at all, like someone or something was trying to send a message. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I stood there trying to make sense of what I was looking at. That's when I heard it, a deep, guttural howling sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It seemed to reverberate through the trees surrounding me. I looked around frantically, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it sounded like it was coming from everywhere, all at once. I shouldn't have been scared. I've heard plenty of coyote calls during my time hunting, but this was different, deeper, more guttural, more primordial, like a sound that shouldn't exist in nature. I'm getting freaked out just talking about it again. Part of me knows I must sound crazy, but you have to believe me. The things I saw and heard out there, they weren't normal. They weren't right. Oh God, I gotta take a minute. Reliving this is really messing with my head. You have no idea how absolutely terrifying it was. Let me back up and describe the terrain a bit more. Like I said, this was a very remote stretch of forest in northern Michigan, miles from any towns or even proper roads, just endless dense woods as far as the eye could see, with a few small creeks and marshes dotting the landscape. The particular area I hunt is what I'd call a bowl or depression, a lower elevation point surrounded by higher ridges on most sides. The trees are older growth with a very thick canopy overhead. The ground is uneven with lots of dips, hills, fallen logs, and boulder fields. Not an easy area to navigate, especially when visibility is low in the mornings and evenings. There are a few overgrown game trails that I've marked as access routes, but they only go so far before petering out. Once you get off those main paths, it's incredibly easy to get turned around if you aren't careful. The woods seem to shift and change with every bend. What looks like a clear path 1 minute can become an impassable tangle of brush and deadfall the next. That's part of what made the discovery of that structure so unnerving. We were talking about a significant distance from any established trails, at least a mile or two into the heart of this rugged, inhospitable terrain. Areas of the forest where I've never even seen signs of human activity, let alone anything resembling a campsite or shelter. So how did someone or something managed to construct something like that without leaving any other traces? No trash, no equipment, no heavily trodden paths from transporting materials. It just didn't make any sense, and that's what really set my mind spiraling those next few days in the woods, because as strange as that structure was, it was just the beginning. The noises I heard, the new trails and markers that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was like I had stumbled into someone's territory, and they were trying to send me a message. After that guttural howling sound dissipated, I figured it was time for me to get the hell out of there. Whatever was going on in those woods, I didn't want any part of it. I'm a hunter, not an idiot. If something seemed off, my instincts told me to trust that feeling. But as I tried to retrace my steps back to the cabin, that's when I realized something else was very wrong. The markings on the trees, the pathways I thought I knew, they had all shifted. What I previously thought were my trails now led in entirely new directions. It was like the entire landscape had been rearranged overnight, as if whatever or whomever had made that structure was now toying with me, reshaping the woods to keep me turned around and lost. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up again. Panic started creeping in at the edges of my mind. I'm a grown man, but I'll admit I had to fight back tears in that moment. This went against all logic and reason. How was this happening? I must have wandered around aimlessly for hours, desperately trying to reorient myself and find a way back to some semblance of familiarity. But everywhere I turned, there were only more strange rock piles, tree markings, and misleading trails, like a maze designed to keep me trapped. That's when I started finding the other things. Bone-chilling stuff that makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. Little tokens, I guess you could call them, made from sticks and twine and other forest debris, tiny humanoid figurines, effigies hung from branches, makeshift dolls made from moss and twigs with animal bones for limbs. At first I thought they were some sort of hunting charms left by another hunter, or maybe a Native American ritual practice, but the further I ventured, the more disturbing and ominous they became. Some looked like mutilated human forms, covered in what I desperately hoped was just mud and not, I'm getting queasy again just describing them. The craftsmanship and detail that went into some of them, it was like they were made by something with intelligence and a very dark, sinister mindset. I knew I had to find my way out of those woods as soon as possible. Staying put would only make me an easier target for whatever sick bastards were behind those effigy things. But with every passing hour, I felt more and more turned around. Panic and exhaustion were setting in. At one point, I dropped down into a dried-up creek bed, hoping to at least find some landmark I could follow out. That's when I turned over a flat rock and saw it, a crude drawing scratched into the dirt. It looked like a twisted, nightmarish version of the little humanoid figurines I'd been finding. This one had exaggerated claws and teeth, almost like a feral, monstrous caricature. Underneath the drawing were some symbols or shapes I didn't recognize, maybe some sort of written language. I'm no expert, but they definitely didn't look like anything I'd seen before, more like alien hieroglyphs than anything human-made. My mind started racing, wondering if I had stumbled across some sort of cult territory. I must have stood there analyzing that awful drawing for a solid 10 minutes, trying to make sense of it. That's when I heard that guttural howl again, the same bone-chilling, unnatural call from before, but way closer now, like it was coming from the trees right above me. I shined my flashlight up, half expecting to see a bear or big cat ready to pounce, but the beam just illuminated more of those hanging effigies, swaying gently from the branches above. Except these ones, they almost seemed to be moving, twitching in a way that sent a shock of revulsion through me. I didn't stick around to find out if it was just my fear playing tricks. I booked it out of there as fast as I could, not even caring about which direction I was headed. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and whatever was in those woods. That's when I finally spotted something I recognized. The old deer trail that marked the boundary of my hunting area. I don't think I've ever been so relieved to see that worn-down path in my life. I must have made it about 2 miles before finally collapsing in exhaustion. I must have blacked out for a while from sheer exhaustion and fear, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in near total darkness. At first I thought maybe I had made it back to the cabin somehow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized that couldn't be possible. The air was damp and musty, with just a faint hint of light filtering in through some cracks above. I was inside some kind of structure, but not the rickety old deer cabin I knew. This place reeked of earth and decay. As I tried to get my bearings, I reached out to feel around, only to recoil in horror at what my hands found. Hanging all around me were those same sickening human effigies, like some sort of makeshift chamber of nightmares. My breathing became rapid and shallow as I realized the full extent of my predicament. I wasn't just lost in the woods anymore. Somehow I had been taken, captured, and brought to this this vile place like an animal trapped in a snare. That's when I heard the first of the sounds, a faint skittering like insects moving across the earthen floor, then a low, guttural groaning that seemed to reverberate through the very walls. I tell you, in that moment, I was more terrified than I've ever been in my life. My mind raced with visions of some inbred backwoods cult about to torture me for whatever sick rituals they had planned. The noises grew louder, closer. I could hear them just outside now, like they were circling whatever this underground pit was, waiting, watching. Then a new sound joined the cacophony, a strange, piercing trill that set my teeth on edge. It was almost like an insect cry, but deeper, more guttural, and mixed with other unearthly howls and clicks. That's when the first appendage broke through the dirt wall beside me. I wish I could unsee what slithered out of that hole. I don't mind telling you I nearly soiled myself when that thing emerged from the wall. If I hadn't been frozen in sheer primal terror, I'm sure I would have started screaming until my voice gave out. It looked like nothing I've ever seen before in nature. Imagine a massive centipede or millipede, but one that had been merged with the body of a sickly, emaciated human. It had far too many legs, segmented appendages that seemed to undulate and writhe with a life of their own. But the true nightmare fuel was the torso and head region. Fused to those wriggling insect legs was the upper body of what looked like a decayed corpse. Leathery, desiccated skin pulled taut against protruding bones, elongated arms that ended in grotesque pincers where the hands should be, and the face, dear God, the face. I don't even want to describe what passed for its head. Just trying to put it into words makes me want to retch. All I can say is it had far too many eyes, antennae, and a mouth that seemed to pull itself into an eternal silent scream, like staring into the twisted visage of oblivion itself. More and more of those things started to emerge, slithering out of holes and crevices all around me, their appendages clicking and scraping along the dirt floor in a way that burrowed deep into my psyche. I was surrounded on all sides by these hellish abominations. Part of my mind must have just shut down in sheer self-preservation because I remember very little after that initial emergence. Just fragments of skittering sounds and unearthly shrieks, fleeting glimpses of those nightmare forms closing in around me, their pincers and mandibles snapping hungrily. The next thing I knew, I was outside again, stumbling back towards the cabin in a cold sweat. I had no conception of how much time had passed or what happened in that subterranean chamber of horrors. My mind had simply buried it, whether out of trauma or as a merciful self-defense against true insanity. All I knew was I had been face to face with something far older and darker than humanity was ever meant to witness. I must have made it back to the cabin by sheer muscle memory alone because my mind was just gone, a blank, catatonic state of shock. I've experienced my fair share of trauma in life, but nothing could have prepared me for the overwhelming dread and violation I felt after that encounter. For days, maybe even weeks, I was essentially a hollow husk, staring at the walls, rocking back and forth, trying in vain to process what I had seen, what I had experienced down in that nest of ancient, inhuman malice. Food was forgotten. Sleep was impossible. Any time I drifted off, those visions would come screaming back in the form of night terrors, grotesque apparitions of those insectoid forms hovering over me, their pincers and fanged maws opened wide to devour what little remained of my sanity. I've never been one to believe in supernatural boogeymen or make-believe monsters. I'm about as grounded and pragmatic as they come. but there was simply no rational scientific explanation for what I encountered out there in the woods. Those things, they defied all categorization. They were older than man, older than reason itself. We like to think we've tamed the wilderness and conquered the unknown, but all I can say is we haven't, not by a long shot. There are still mysteries out there that should never be unearthed, ancient primordial horrors left over from the true nightmare eras of this planet's evolution. I finally managed to force down some food and water after who knows how long, but it did little to halt the downward spiral I was in. If anything, having a somewhat clearer head made the memories that much more vivid and harrowing. I knew I needed to get professional help before the trauma destroyed me completely. It was a risk, given how insane my story would undoubtedly sound to anyone on the outside. But I figured a mental institution would be a better fate than staying out in those woods, surrounded by the darkness that now seemed to permeate every waking moment. I packed up what little supplies I could carry and started the long trek back to civilization. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf had me nearly jumping out of my skin. The shadows on the trail seemed to shift and contort into living, malevolent forms in my paranoid state. I've never been one to scare easily, but after my experience, the entire forest had become tainted, corrupted by the presence of that ancient, indescribable evil. It was like a miasma had seeped into the very soil and trees themselves. A couple of times I could have sworn I heard those guttural clicking sounds in the distance, like the fluttering of insect wings mixed with the shrieks of the damned. My heart would seize up and I'd start sprinting wildly, not even caring which direction I was headed, just putting as much distance between me and those accursed woods as possible. When I finally staggered out of the tree line onto a rural highway, I'm sure I was a sight to be seen. Wild-eyed, clothes torn to shreds, covered in grime and who knows what else. A couple passing motorists actually pulled over, probably thinking I was a deranged drifter about to attack them. I don't even remember what lies I told them to convince them to give me a ride into town. Something about getting lost on a hiking trip and running out of supplies, I'm sure. Anything to avoid the truth that still makes me question my own grip on reality to this day. The looks I got from the staff at the county mental health clinic when I arrived were unsettling, to say the least. Like they could already see the abyss of psychological trauma waiting behind my eyes. For my own part, I knew my story was going to sound utterly insane. Hell, even I didn't fully believe it, and I was the one who lived through that nightmare. So I tried to be as vague as possible with the details at first, just explaining that I'd had some kind of psychotic break or break with reality while out in the woods alone. That seemed to be enough for them to admit me, at least preliminarily, while they evaluated my case. Part of me was relieved to be in that sterile, institutional environment. As alien and unsettling as it was, at least I could take solace knowing I was far away from those thrice-damned woods, away from whatever inhabited the deeper, darker recesses of that ancient wilderness. For the first few days at the clinic, I was essentially catatonic, only speaking when absolutely necessary, flinching at every sudden sound or movement. The nurses and attendants seemed to think I was suffering from acute panic attacks or dissociative episodes. In a way, I suppose they weren't far off. My mind had shattered into a million jagged shards after my experience, each one replaying snippets of those waking night terrors over and over. The sights, the smells, the unearthly sounds, they all coalesced into an endless looping horror reel burned into my psyche. I knew that sooner or later I would have to try to articulate at least some version of what happened. As insane as it would undoubtedly sound, keeping that trauma bottled up would only exacerbate the psychological damage. So after about a week of observation and medication, I finally worked up the nerve to ask for a one-on-one session with one of the clinic's psychiatrists, a grizzled older man with a thick beard and seemingly infinite reservoirs of patience behind his eyes. Even as I sit here now, putting what I saw into plain language feels like an exercise in madness. How does one even begin to describe the indescribable, to convey the existential, soul-withering dread of coming face to face with something that should not exist in this reality? I tried to start out as clinically and detached as possible, speaking in a monotone about discovering the strange campsite and effigies out in the woods where I hunt, explaining my growing sense of disorientation and paranoia as more and more bizarre occurrences started manifesting around me. But when I got to the part about being trapped underground, surrounded by those monstrous insect-human hybrid abominations, that's when I could feel my throat constricting and the cold sweat of panic starting to bead on my forehead. The psychiatrist remained silent, his pen scribbling notes while I desperately tried to convey the sheer, uncompounded alienness of those entities, how they seemed to be some ungodly hybrid of insectile and vaguely humanoid features, fused together into shambling, twitching forms that triggered an instinctive, primordial revulsion. As the words tumbled out, I could see the skepticism mounting behind the doctor's eyes, not surprising given how utterly unhinged and deranged I must have sounded in that moment. The more I spoke, the more frantic and unhinged I became. Rationality and composure quickly crumbled as the floodgates of traumatic memory burst open. I started babbling about the inhuman sounds, the skittering appendages, the leering, malformed faces with their grotesque pincers and mandibles. At a certain point, the psychiatrist held up his hand and suggested we take a break. I could tell he thought I was teetering on the verge of a psychotic break or mental fugue state. Can't say I could really blame him. I was literally raving like a madman about unholy creatures and underground lairs. They increased my sedatives and antipsychotics after that first disastrous interview, put me in a secure room for monitoring in case I proved to be a danger to myself or others. I remember lying on that rubber mat, staring at the heavily grated windows, and feeling utterly alone in the universe. What plagues me most is not the judgments or concerns of the clinic staff, but the creeping notion that my experience really was some sort of complete psychic break from reality, that my mind literally fractured into delusion after being exposed to some sort of trigger out in those woods. Because I'll admit, the things I claimed to have seen, heard, felt, they seemed to transcend even the most feverish nightmares when I tried to recall them in explicit detail. Almost like I've opened the door to a realm of aberrant cosmic horrors never meant for human comprehension. Part of me wonders if that underground chamber, that hive or nest or whatever hellish enclosure it was, maybe it represented the manifestation of a subconscious descent into primal, atavistic dread. The exposed id, if you will, of the human animal coming face to face with its most primordial, deep-seated terrors. Or maybe, and this is what causes me to awake screaming most nights, maybe it was all too real. Maybe I really did cross a forbidden threshold out there in the wilderness and bore witness to something that could shatter even the most resilient psyche. Either way, in the aftermath, I've come to accept that a part of me is lost forever, consumed and hollowed out by an entity or force beyond any mortal frame of reference. All I can do now is cling to whatever shreds of stability remain and avoid anything that could potentially trigger a relapse. The clinic eventually transferred me to their long-term residential ward after it became clear I wasn't making any meaningful progress. By that point, I had mostly retreated into a catatonic state, capable of little more than following basic prompts and instructions from the staff. My waking hours were an endless delirium, punctuated by night terrors so violently visceral that I would often awake being forcibly restrained by orderlies. Apparently, my screams and fits of panic had become so extreme that they feared I was a danger to myself and others around me. I've suffered from bouts of sleep paralysis and night terrors in the past, but never anything to this degree. These episodes, they were like being trapped in a realm of lucid, inescapable dread, surrounded by those same insectoid aberrations, their pincered appendages clawing at my flesh, while their malformed faces split into cavernous maws to consume me. There were times when I could barely distinguish between the nightmares and reality. A heaviness would descend, distorting the contours of the room into eldritch geometries that seemed to pulsate in time with a low, guttural thrumming, as if whatever primordial evil dwelled behind that veil of reality was reaching out to shatter what remained of my fragile psyche. The medication became stronger, more experimental, a cocktail of antipsychotics, anti-anxiety drugs, mood stabilizers, and who knows what else being pumped into my system around the clock, all in a desperate attempt to numb me, to pull me back from that yawning abyss of existential horror my mind seemed determined to plumb. There were stretches, weeks, or maybe even months, where I barely registered my surroundings at all, just a hollow, dissociative state of simply existing while the carousel of treatment regimens changed around me. Is a form of oblivion, I suppose, an unconscious coping mechanism to protect whatever shards remained of my sanity. Then at times I would become violently lucid again, screaming and thrashing at unseen presences, clawing at the walls as those subterranean visions took hold with renewed vigor. I've no doubt I terrorized the staff during those episodes, raving like a lunatic about ancient cosmic horrors from the black between the stars. There's no returning from looking too long into that abyss, my friend. No matter how much medication or therapy or good old-fashioned willpower you throw at it. Once your mind has been exposed, fractured by the merest glimpse of the true outer reality, you're simply ruined. A husk waiting for the inevitable trigger to release the floodgates of madness anew. I know this all must sound like the deranged ramblings of a truly diseased mind. Hearing myself recount these things, it's no wonder the clinic staff regarded me as a complete psychotic break from the start. What rational person would accept any of this as plausible reality? Part of me regrets subjecting you to this deluge of psychological and existential horror. You reached out in good faith, never expecting to open the doorway into my personal waking nightmare. I can only imagine how disturbing and troubling this all must sound through the lens of a stable, well-adjusted psyche. Truth be told, I'm not even sure why I feel this pathological need to relive these experiences, picking endlessly at the cosmic scab they've left on my consciousness. Some form of masochistic penance, a desperate attempt to convince myself it was all some fever dream delusion by constantly re-exposing myself to the trauma. Maybe it's simply that by putting words to the visions, no matter how fragmented or incoherent, I can try to maintain some fragile sense of control. to quantify the chaos into language, despite how paltry and inadequate those words may be in conveying the true depths of the dread. All I know is, once you've been exposed to the true, unfathomable underpinnings of our reality, once you've caught that fleeting, peripheral glimpse behind the veil, you can never truly return to who you once were. It marks you down to the very core of your being in a way no amount of repression or dosages can ever entirely alleviate. So yes, I keep picking at the scars, reopening the psychic wounds to let them fester and ooze their putrid recollections, not for your benefit or even my own, but because it is simply the way of things now, my own private, endless cycle of devolution into a state of irreversible, gnawing mania. Please feel no need to indulge these admissions further. I am far beyond the point where any external input can pull me back from that event horizon of subjective alien dread. This need to divulge, to describe the indescribable, it is my burden alone to shoulder now, a penance, as I said before, for having looked upon that which was never meant for human comprehension. I want to thank you for lending an ear to my ramblings, as disturbing and incoherent as they may sound. I know it couldn't have been easy listening to such deeply unsettling subject matter. Just my attempt to put those experiences into words seems to have struck a dissonant chord in whatever still remains of my tattered psyche. When I first read your own account about the Ohio dogman sighting, I'll admit there was a part of me that recoiled in skeptical dismissal, not because I doubted your truthfulness, but because it represented a small breach in the quarantine I've tried to maintain around my own traumatic encounter with the unknown. But there was another part, a smaller voice buried beneath the layers of psychological scar tissue that felt understood. As outlandish as the details may have seemed on the surface, I recognized in your retelling those same pangs of confusion, fear, and existential dread that have become so numbingly familiar to me. In a strange way, having someone else describe that sense of being exposed to something transcending our comprehension of reality, it gave me a perspective I hadn't considered before. Your courage in sharing that experience, no matter how bizarre, made me realize I wasn't so alone after all. And so I found myself compelled to reciprocate that vulnerability, to try and convey the true, ineffable depths of the alienation and cosmic horror I experienced, no matter how futile or damaging those efforts may prove. If nothing else, maybe it can provide the kernel of solace that the abyss, once witnessed, connects us all as scattered survivors. I don't know if anything I've described here today can ever be rationally accepted or integrated. More likely it will be dismissed as the ravings of a hopelessly broken mind. But I've made peace with that likelihood. My own sense of objective truth was the first casualty in all of this. All I can hope for now is that you'll understand my need to tear open these psychic wounds and let them bleed out onto the page. It's an inevitability, like the tide or the orbit of celestial bodies, a force of nature both beautiful and damning in its cosmic indifference. So thank you, Matthew, for being that sounding board, however inadvertent. In opening the lines of communication about the unknown, you've allowed me to confront, or at least give voice to, the very trauma that has unmade me. Whether that constitutes healing or a final feverish descent, well, I suppose only the void knows for sure. Thanks so much, guys, for making it to the end. Everyone should comment down below their favorite moment from the video or their favorite story. Stay tuned for more great content coming from Planet 412. I'll see you all soon.